other leadership positions with the Inspector General's office, including Assistant Inspector General for Legal Affairs, Acting Counsel to the Inspector General, Director of Special Review Groups, and Acting Assistant Inspector General for External Affairs. Prior to joining the Office of Inspector General, Ms. Shaw practiced law with the firm's white-collar crime group, specializing in internal investigations and compliance counseling. Ms. Shaw, we thank you for taking the time to participate in today's hearing on this critical issue. We welcome you to the committee, and we look forward to your testimony. And I would ask you now to please rise so that I can swear you in. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative, and we are now happy to receive your written testimony. Please know that your entire testimony will be entered into the record, and we would like to hear a summary in 5 minutes or so. We have a light, or usually we have a light, that tells you when your time is up. When it goes yellow is a minute left. When it's when it's red, the 5 minutes are up. And we would love to hear from you at this moment.
Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss DHS-OIG's recent work on conditions at Customs and Border Protection holding facilities at the southern border. My testimony today will focus on the dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention recently observed by DHS-OIG inspectors in both the El Paso del Norte Processing Center and at facilities in the Rio Grande Valley. These issues pose a serious and imminent threat to the health and safety both of DHS personnel and detainees, and require the department's immediate attention and action. DHS-OIG conducts unannounced inspections of CBP facilities to evaluate compliance with CBP's transport, escort, detention, and search standards, otherwise known as TEDS standards. TEDS standards govern CBP's interactions with detainees, providing guidance on things like duration of detention, access to food and water, access to medical care, and hygiene. Our unannounced inspections enable us to identify instances of noncompliance with TEDS and to propose appropriate corrective action. In doing so, we seek to drive transparency and accountability at the Department of Homeland Security. Although CBP has struggled at times to achieve full compliance with detention standards, our recent unannounced inspections revealed a situation far more grievous than any our inspectors had previously encountered. For instance, when our team arrived at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center, they found that this facility, which has a maximum capacity of 125 detainees, had more than 750 detainees on site. The following day, that number had increased to 900. At all the Border Patrol facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley, we also observed serious overcrowding among unaccompanied alien children, or UACs. Additionally, we found that individuals, including children, were being detained well beyond the 72 hours generally permitted under TED standards and the Flores Agreement. For instance, at the Centralized Processing Center in McAllen, Texas, many children had been in custody longer than a week. Some UACs under the age of 7 had been in custody for more than 2 weeks. Under these circumstances, CBP has struggled to comply with TED standards. For instance, although all facilities we visited in the Rio Grande Valley had infant formula, diapers, baby wipes, and juice and snacks for children, 2 facilities had not provided children access to hot meals, as required, until the week we arrived for our inspections. Additionally, children at 3 of the 5 facilities we visited had no access to showers, limited access to a change of clothes, and no access to laundry facilities. Space limitations also affect single adults. The lack of space has restricted CBP's ability to separate detainees with infectious diseases, including chickenpox, scabies, and influenza, from each other and from the general population. According to CBP management, these conditions also affect the health of Border Patrol agents, who are experiencing high incidence of illness. Further, there is a concern that the overcrowding and prolonged detention may be contributing to rising tensions among detainees. A senior manager at one facility in the Rio Grande Valley called the situation, quote, a ticking time bomb. Despite these immense challenges, we observed CBP staff interacting with detainees in a professional and respectful manner, and in general attempting to comply with standards to the extent possible. Notwithstanding these efforts, Border Patrol requires immediate assistance to manage the overcrowding in its facilities. CBP is not responsible for providing long-term detention, and CBP facilities like those we visited are not designed to hold individuals for lengthy periods. However, with limited bed space available at ICE and HHS long-term facilities nationwide, detainees are left in CBP custody until a placement can be found. In its response to our recent management alerts, DHS described the situation on the southern border as, quote, an acute and worsening crisis. Our observations comport with that characterization, which is why we have called on the department to take immediate action to begin to remedy the situation. Although DHS has asserted that it has reduced the number of UACs in custody in the last few weeks, we remain concerned that it is not taking sufficient steps to address the overcrowding and prolonged detention we observed, particularly with respect to single adult detainees. We will continue to monitor the situation at the border and have already begun new work aimed specifically at identifying the root causes of some of these issues. We hope this work will assist the department in addressing these challenges. In the meantime, however, DHS leadership must develop a strategic, coordinated approach that will allow it to make good on its commitment to ensure the safety, security, and care of those in its custody. Ms. Chairwoman, this concludes my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony, for your work, and for your report. And I would ask unanimous consent that the report itself be made a part of this record. Before moving to questions, I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The title of today's hearing, Overcrowding and Prolonged Detention at CBP Facilities, barely begins to convey the inhumane conditions children and families in CBP custody are experiencing in facilities along the southern border. Today, we'll focus on 6 Texas CBP facilities recently examined by the Inspector General's office, which documented a culture of utter neglect and disregard for migrants that is profoundly disturbing. The IG's report is bad enough, but it must not be read in a vacuum. We also cannot ignore the reports of sexual assault and retaliation against children at the Yuma Processing Center in Arizona, nor can we overlook the racist and misogynist Facebook postings by current and former CBP officers that dehumanized migrants and disparaged female members of Congress. Not only did CBP leadership know about this group, it now appears that the chief of the Border Patrol herself was a member. This is the context in which we must consider the horrible conditions in CBP facilities. On May 30th, 2019, the IG issued a management alert that focused on dangerous overcrowding of single adults at the Del Norte Processing Center, including the packing of 900 individuals into a space with a maximum capacity of 125, and the holding of 41 individuals in a cell designed to hold 8. This overcrowding made it impossible for men and women to lie down, and some were forced to stay in standing room-only conditions for days and even weeks. The photos accompanying the management alert powerfully illustrate the misery and suffering at these facilities. Although the DHS concurred with the IG's recommendations, the agency claims that it will not be able to correct these problems until November 30th, 2020, nearly 18 months from now. It is outrageous that DHS leadership could read this report and decide that men, women, and children could be detained in these deplorable, horrible conditions for 18 more months. Just 5 weeks later, on July 2nd, the IG issued another management alert that focused on the dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention of children and adults at 5 CBP facilities in the Texas Rio Grande Valley. The IG documented that some 1,500 children and adults were held in short-term holding rooms longer than the 72 hours generally permitted, including more than 50 children 7 years old or younger who had been detained for over 2 weeks. Most of these individuals had not showered for the entire duration of their detention, even though several of them had been held for as long as a month. And most were still wearing the clothing they arrived in days, weeks, and even up to a month before. That we would treat any human being this way is unconscionable, and the situation cannot be blamed solely on the increased number of asylum seekers arriving at the southern border. CBP made a choice here. ICE and the Department of Health and Human Services have the mandate and infrastructure to detain individuals for longer than 72 hours. If those facilities are full, however, CBP has the authority to release individuals and families after completion of intake processing. There is no doubt that the overcrowding and conditions documented in the 6 Texas facilities warranted release of at least some of these asylum seekers. But it appears to be the Trump administration's policy to continue holding children and families in such conditions as a form of torture in order to deter others from coming. This is neither necessary, nor conscionable, nor sustainable. There is a humanitarian crisis in Central America, and the Trump administration's policies are now creating a humanitarian crisis in our country, too. The IG has done a great service to our nation by regularly and impartially reviewing CBP conditions. Their findings require prompt action consistent with American laws and American values. And later this week, the Judiciary Committee plans to take up legislation to address deficiencies in CBP custody facilities. I thank the chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren, for holding this important hearing. I appreciate Ms. Shaw appearing today to discuss her office's findings. I'm glad for her testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Collins will certainly be recognized if he is able to come. Otherwise, we will invite him to put his statement into the record. But to be even, I'll go to Mr. Armstrong for his question, since Mr. Buck has asked that we go to him next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In May 30th, 2019, the OIG report found conditions of overcrowding at the El Paso del Norte Processing Center. The report on page 2 noted that total apprehensions during the first 7 months of fiscal year 2019 have already surpassed that of the total apprehensions of each of the same time period this fiscal year, for the past 4 years. It also has a chart comparing just for the El Paso sector, that same time period this fiscal year between October and April compared to last year. And it states that the El Paso sector has seen an increase of 374% of unaccompanied alien children, 1,816% family unions, and 82% of single adults. Are those numbers correct?
Yes, sir, that's the data we received from CBP.
And the El Paso sector has experienced the sharpest increase in apprehensions as any other sector, according to the report.
That's correct.
So if there were no individuals, if there were no illegal crossings of the border, there wouldn't be overcrowding at these facilities?
Well, Border Patrol facilities are specifically for individuals apprehended between ports of entry, so those who present at ports of entry remain there. Those who cross the border between go to the BP facilities, Border Patrol.
So yes.
Yes, if we had no one crossing between ports of entry, there would be no one in those facilities.
Your May 30th report noted that further limiting available space was the need to separate detainees with infectious diseases such as chickenpox, scabies, and the flu from each other and the general population, and that the facility only had 7 general cells and 3 small isolation cells, right?
That's correct.
And the report also noted that the ability of ICE to accept single adults into its detention infrastructure is strained, stating that ICE does not currently have sufficient detention bed space to take all Border Patrol's adult detainees, even though the report states in its footnote that ICE accepts single adults into ICE detention facilities as soon as space becomes available. So even though CBP completes processing of these individuals in a few days, these single adults are backing up in CBP custody because ICE doesn't have the room for them.
That's correct, and that's according to CBP management.
And the report indicates that overcrowded conditions are a result of 1, high numbers of people crossing, 2, the need to separate detainees with infectious diseases, and 3, the inability of ICE to accept single adults from CBP due to lack of bed space.
Those do seem to be some of the factors driving the issue.
So if Congress doesn't act to do things such as providing more ICE bed space or by addressing the root causes of the large numbers of migrants arriving on the southern border in the first place, CBP's only option to address the overcrowded conditions would be what, to release them?
That could be one option, creating more space to detain them, but that wouldn't address the prolonged detention issue.
And that's kind of one of the problems with the word immediately. I mean, we say immediately, we want something to happen, but creating more space cannot happen overnight, right? I mean, you have to, I mean, whether it's a tent facility, I mean, it still has to be something that can work. So, I mean, what's a time frame to put one of these facilities up if everybody moved as quickly as possible?
I don't have precise statistics on that. I do know that the soft-sided structures are able to be deployed fairly quickly, and in the management response that we received from DHS to the management alert, they indicated that some of those facilities were up and ready to accept individuals, but the more complicated structures were going to take more time.
Well, and the reason I talk about it immediately is the OIG response to DHS response reiterated that immediate action is needed, and I think everybody agrees with that. But other than those steps that DHS is taking within the confines of the resources Congress has given them, what specifically does the OIG office expect DHS to do?
What we put in our management alert was we were looking for some action to address the issue. The response that we got was that the larger structure would not be ready until 2020. And so we couldn't consider that a resolved recommendation when we're looking for something immediate.
Well, and that is even before we talk about judicial injunctions and lawsuits, and I mean, those are going on. I mean, none of this is occurring in a legislative vacuum either. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can't prevent people from arriving sick and in need of medical care or segregation, and that we've already maxed out ICE bed space. I just go back to, is the only other alternative just to release everybody?
I can't give you an answer on that at this point. What I can tell you is that part of the work that we have ongoing is to look at the root causes and allow us to do the deeper dive that would help us present some recommendations that we think could help solve the problem. Our management alerts are really meant to shine a light on an issue that is so important or emergent that we don't want to wait to do complete reporting and do the work that goes into creating solutions and recommendations. So this is a preliminary snapshot of the issue. We are doing that more in-depth dive at this point, and hope to have some very helpful recommendations come out of that work.
Well, and I appreciate that because I think we need triage and long-term solutions. Thank you.
The chairman of the committee, Mr. Nadler, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for testifying here today. We appreciate you being here. I want to discuss the two management alerts you put out recently, focusing on an inspection of the El Paso Del Norte Processing Center. As Representative Lofgren mentioned in her opening statement, we visited that facility back in late March. And even then, the facility was extremely overcrowded, with people being held for long periods of time. Your inspection found things had deteriorated even further. The report provides the following evidence of overcrowding, including photographs: a cell with a maximum capacity of 12 people holding 76, a cell with a maximum capacity of 8 holding 41, a cell with a maximum capacity of 35 holding 155 people. For each of these cells, which we understand were only examples of the overcrowding at Del Norte, could you please estimate the size of the cell in terms of length and width?
I was not personally there, so I'm going off the same photographs that you have. I could get that information for you as a take-back.
Okay. Can you describe the conditions of the people and the insides of these cells, and understanding that you were not able to speak with, as you witnessed them, and understanding you were not able to speak with them directly?
Yes, so based on the photographs and the reports back from my team, many of the people in the cells that were over capacity were standing shoulder to shoulder. There wasn't room to sit down. There certainly wasn't room to lie down.
So how did they sleep? Standing up?
It was a challenge. I think we also reported that in some instances, individuals were standing on top of the toilets in order to get a little extra breathing room. So it was very, very crowded, and of course that contributes to a lot of issues, including possibility for transmitting infectious disease and potentially rising
and lack of
tensions.
accessibility of that toilet for use.
Correct.
What steps, if any, was CPB taking to remedy this situation, the situation about the toilets being used for standing on instead of for use?
My understanding is that The conditions were what they were. They were trying to triage as best as possible. As you saw from some of the photographs, many of the individuals at that facility were outside for processing and would never have even seen the inside of the facility, so they're making use of that outside parking lot space as an effort to triage and release some of the pressure on the inside of the facility. Some of the detainees are moved to other facilities as quickly as possible, but even with those measures in place, it was still overcrowded in a way that our inspectors...
The report says that Border Patrol agents told us, as your office, some of the detainees have been held in standing room only conditions for days and weeks.
That's correct.
Based on these admissions, is it your understanding that there were people in the facility who had not been able to sit or lie down for days or weeks?
In the most crowded cells, we did not go in to speak directly with the individual detainees, so I can't comment on the personal circumstances, but in standing room only conditions, it's hard to imagine how anybody could
And they were there for days and weeks in those
sleep.
conditions?
Correct.
Have you ever been in a CBP detention facility before where there were individuals who were not able to stand for 24 hours, let alone, or to sit for 24 hours, let alone multiple days or weeks?
I have not personally. I know my team has seen overcrowding in its day, but this certainly rose to a new level, which is part of what prompted us to write the management alerts.
And lastly, I want to draw your attention to a photo on page 6 of the report. Your team observed staff discarding personal items, including backpacks, suitcases, handbags, and a child's doll in a dumpster. Did you witness CBP staff opening up, reviewing, assessing the condition, and/or inventorying the personal items of immigrants before throwing them into a dumpster?
Again, I did not personally witness it, but our team did watch as they confiscated the materials and discarded them, and they were not being individually reviewed.
They were not being individually inventoried, so we don't know what they were throwing out.
Right, for the items in that dumpster. Now, when people did present, their valuables were tagged, things like phones and wallets, but the larger items got discarded.
Now, to the extent you were able to watch CBP staff handling personal items, could you estimate how long an officer took to assess the condition of an item before throwing it in a dumpster?
I don't know. I think it was a fairly fast assessment, but I could get more details on that for you.
Thank you. And finally, staff told you and your investigators that it was necessary to dispose of all these personal items because they presented a, quote, biohazard, unquote. Based on your observations regarding staff's treatment of these personal items, was staff in a position to make this assessment that these were all biohazards, and were you satisfied with this justification?
I'm afraid I don't have information on that. I can tell you that under the TED standards, typically what should happen is that all of the property should be tagged and should move with the individual through the facility. This was, I think, a relatively new explanation that we've received, the issue of biohazard. It was clear that some of the items were wet and muddy, but others did not appear to be visibly so.
It was clear that a lot of the belongings were just being thrown out pell-mell with no regard given to safeguarding the belongings of these people.
They were being collected and discarded, that's correct.
Thank you very much. My time has expired.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Shaw, isn't it true that these locations, El Paso and the Rio Grande Valley, were specifically selected for inspections because those sectors had seen unprecedented increase in the numbers of apprehensions?
That's one of the factors we consider. We also look at complaints we've received through the OIG hotline, information that we've collected on past inspections, and we also rely on our investigators who are in the field and familiar with the facilities to help us identify where we ought to be looking.
And by law, CBP is required to place unaccompanied alien children in its custody with Health and Human Services, correct?
I don't know that that's actually the case, but typically for long-term detention, UACs are handed off from CBP to HHS ORR.
Yeah, it's my understanding it's required by law that that occurs, and it's supposed to happen within 72 hours. But if HHS doesn't have a shelter space for a child in CBP custody, I don't understand what they're supposed to do if there's not a place to take them. So should CBP simply release the child out onto the streets within the 72-hour period provided for in law for that transfer to occur?
No, I don't think that they should do that. I think that's exactly the issue. They're having to hold people much longer than was anticipated under the law.
So it's not really CBP's problem. Well, it's a problem, but it's not really their responsibility if they physically don't have anywhere to legally put this child They're not going to, just as you said, you don't want them to just release the child out and let the child go, because that's going to create a number of different issues. So what are they supposed to do if there's not a place to transfer them to in an HHS bed?
That's exactly the problem that we're seeing. They have limited options, and so they're holding people for longer periods of time than the 72 hours.
So it's not that Customs and Border Patrol is actively preventing children from being transferred to HHS custody, it's because they don't have a place to take them.
So we did not observe any indication that CBP was actively holding UACs or minors back from transfer. I can't say with absolute certainty, because we haven't finished our work yet, whether CBP has some role in the delays in transfer. That's something we would be looking at. For instance, if it's a manual process and there's missing information. But CBP has certainly suggested that lack of space at the HHS facilities is part of the problem in terms of the prolonged detention of UACs.
So in your observation, then, the unaccompanied children are being moved to HHS bed space as soon as possible?
As soon as HHS can notify them of a placement and transportation can be arranged, yes.
Okay. Both of your reports express concern for the welfare of the CBP officers and agents as well as the individuals in custody. Wouldn't you agree that congressional inaction to address the border crisis is putting our law enforcement personnel to increase an unnecessary risk of illness, anxiety, and violence?
I don't have an opinion on that. I can tell you from our work that it is creating a pressure situation for the agents. We did observe agents stressed, anxious, high incidence of illness, not only of the agents, but their families.
Well, and you
so it
talked
is
about
creating a
disease
difficult
amongst
situation.
the individuals coming into custody, and some of those are contagious diseases. So if the officers are being susceptible to that, then that's obviously putting them at risk to get those illnesses.
That's true.
Your office remained unsatisfied with DHS's responses to the management alerts, and you stated in your testimony that you remain concerned that DHS needs to take immediate steps, and this is along the lines of what Mr. Armstrong was asking. So wouldn't the only other immediate steps to be taken simply to release all single adults, like we were forced to do with family units, and then admit that we have a broken system? And what else are you supposed to do with these single adults?
Right. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on what the solution to the problem is. We are doing a deeper dive to try to understand all of the factors and be able to put forward a more comprehensive set of recommendations. But based on our initial observations, which we reported in the management alert, we don't have a position yet on what would solve the problem.
Well, I mean, we're talking about single adults here. So what if some of those were criminals? I mean, wouldn't it be your position that you don't want criminals released into the American society?
So when we go in, we're looking at compliance with TED standards, and the standards lay out how long people are supposed to stay with CBP. And so we document and report on issues of noncompliance. I'm not going to state an opinion on a broader question about immigration policy.
So you don't have an opinion as to whether we release criminals from other countries into our country? You don't have an opinion on that?
I have an opinion, but I'm here in my official capacity as a member of the IG community. I'm not here to express my personal opinions.
Okay, I yield back to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Shaw, for being here. Is it true that there could be many reasons for why there is overcrowding in CBP related to policy choices that the administration is making?
We have not done the work yet to determine what the root causes are, but we expect that there are going to be a range of issues that come together and create a set of circumstances.
Right. That is why, in fact, you're doing the root causes examination to see why and why folks are backing up at the border.
Precisely.
Earlier, you said that you were discussing the ports of entry question, and you said that apprehensions are up, and that is for between the legal ports of entry, correct?
That's right.
And so what happens when you have a policy that blocks the legal ports of entry for people to enter into? Is it reasonable to say that people then, if they can't come through the legal ports of entry, would then be crossing between the legal ports of entry because we've actually closed those legal ports of entry?
So we have not done extensive work on that, but in our family separations report that we put out last fall, we did identify an instance of at least one, possibly two individuals who had suggested that there could be an uptick in illegal border crossings when there's a backup at the port of entry, but that's something that we would need to look into.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I'm responding to my colleagues across the aisle who are implying that somehow border crossings are up, but the reason they're up is because, in part, and you're going to look at this, so you don't need to answer this question, because the Trump administration has instituted metering, which has essentially closed the legal ports of entry. And as Ms. Lofgren said, we have been to the border many times actually now, and we have actually watched this happening where people are turned back from legal ports of entry because of metering. You didn't look at in your report whether or not ICE beds were actually filled to capacity or whether or not HHS had space. You just asked CBP, is that correct?
That's correct, and we did speak with ICE and HHS, or maybe just ICE, and got some preliminary information on that, but we haven't independently corroborated that information.
So if ICE beds are filled, it could be because we're overusing detention itself. I just want to quote, this was in an article in ProPublica, I think it was Wall Street Journal, that said, by talking about this as a resource issue, DHS is trying to convince people that the problem is a lack of adequate facilities in which to detain people rather than the overuse of detention itself. And before I go to my next questions, I want to call your attention to a BuzzFeed article on July 10th, 2019, where Carla Provost, the CBP border chief, said that HHS didn't have bed space, as you had mentioned, but HHS is quoted in that article, Mr. Weber, as saying that it has taken every unaccompanied child that was referred. So in other words, there was nobody that Border Patrol referred that HHS didn't take. So I hope when you look at the root causes, you will really carefully examine what space was actually available. I want to follow that up for your other, as you go into the root causes discussion. ProPublica on July 12th of 2019 said that this is another piece that I think needs to go to the question that the chairman raised about the actions and the attitude of Border Patrol. But Border Patrol agents were passing around a commemorative coin mocking care for migrant children and just indicated that we should keep the caravans coming so that the money could continue to flow. Let me go to healthcare. Given the severe overcrowding and condition that people arrived in, did the team believe that there were enough healthcare staff, including doctors and nurses, on site to treat illnesses on arrival or as a result of the overcrowding?
So access to medical care is something that we look at. We haven't reported on it yet. We're preparing a capping report to cover all of our unannounced inspections for this year, which will be a more comprehensive look at our findings. It will include access to medical care. I will tell you that beyond sort of a fairly straightforward look at what sort of medical care they're providing in terms of access to individuals, emergency services. We at DHS-OIG don't really have the subject matter expertise at this point to evaluate the quality of that care or to reach a final conclusion about whether it's sufficient. Something that we are considering, funding permitting, is to try to contract to bring in some of that expertise. So that's something that we could consider looking at in future work.
And the last thing I want to raise is, according to notes contained in the FOIA that record discussions between DHS-OIG and CBP and ERO leadership, there were situations in which a mother gave birth and then was returned to CBP custody until the mother could be transferred to ICE custody. Is it your understanding that the newborn accompanied the mother when she was returned to CBP detention? And what justification, if any, did the CBP provide for continuing to detain a newborn baby and a postpartum mother?
I'm sorry, I don't have any information about that particular case.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, just to continue that point, whether they're coming through legal ports of entry or crossing the border between ports of entry, have we seen an increase in illegal immigration over this past year?
I can tell you based on the apprehension data that we got that there's a significant increase, particularly in El Paso sector and the Rio Grande Valley.
Not just an increase, but a significant increase, whether coming through the legal ports of entry or coming illegally across the border itself.
That's correct.
All right. Can you tell us, As these illegal immigrants are entering our country, what is being done to screen for disease, criminal records, verify their actual identity, as well as an actual family relationship with the children they are bringing?
So I can't, I don't have the details on it. CBP does initial processing. At that point, if the adult has arrived with a minor child, they do what they can sort of operationally feasible to evaluate the parental relationship between the child and the parent. They do screening for medical, which it can vary from asking someone how they're feeling or if they have any illnesses to actually looking for indications of illness.
Okay, well, suppose someone were coming through a legal port of entry through, say, San Francisco or New York.
Did you say a legal port of entry?
No, a legal port
Illegal.
of entry, a legal immigrant entering this country. How is the screening for these issues, disease, criminal record, and the like, how is that conducted, and how does that differ with those that are coming illegally across our southern border?
Oh, I see. So when someone presents at a port of entry
Yeah.
without travel documents.
Correct.
Right. I would have to get back to you to determine whether there are any material differences in the way that they're processed. I'll get back with my
I'd
staff and get you
appreciate
some
that.
details on that.
One of the great concerns is that there's very little screening going in as far as disease. If you're simply asking somebody how they're feeling, you're obviously not screening very thoroughly for disease. If you're not actually able to verify their identity, run criminal records, it doesn't sound like you are doing very much to screen for criminals entering the country. And with the actual family relationships, I'm told, perhaps you can help me on this, that there is a fairly large percentage of children being brought into this country by illegal immigrants who are not actually related to them.
I've heard those reports. We have not done any work on that issue.
Well, let me ask you, you're the Inspector General, why aren't you doing work on that issue?
It's a resource issue, but it's something that we are constantly considering. We're looking at issues, doing a risk-based analysis to
I would
determine
think
where
that
best to
those
put our
issues are
resources.
absolutely critical to the security of our southern border and absolutely central to what's going on down there right now.
Very important issues, absolutely.
Let me just expand on the point that Mr. Stubbe raised. A child is apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol. They've got to be released within 72 hours under the Flores Agreement. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if the CBP apprehends children, they're only allowed to release them to HHS?
If it's an unaccompanied alien child, the child is supposed to be transferred into HHS custody.
And that's not just a choice. That has to happen. They're legally required to release these children to that one federal agency, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And the TVPRA requires that these unaccompanied children being released to the HHS is then supposed to process the children, find their relatives, and foster care for them. So the federal law requires them to be released solely to HHS. The department and regulations and consent decree requires this all to be done within 72 hours, but that's not happening, right?
Correct. We have prolonged detention in many cases.
So the CBP's between a rock and a hard place. They're violating their own regulations and the Flores Agreement by keeping these children, but they'd be violating the TVPRA by releasing these children to anyone other than HHS who doesn't have the capacity to accept these children. Is that essentially what's going on?
CBP cannot unilaterally effect a transfer to ICE or HHS. They need ICE and HHS to find a suitable placement.
How important is the $4.6 billion that the president requested months ago and that House Democrats delayed for several months before finally releasing it a week or two ago?
We have not looked at that. We do have ongoing work that is evaluating what CBP's plan is for deploying those funds.
How long will it take those funds to be deployed?
I couldn't tell you, but I know some of them are meant to be spent this year. So there's a very small window in which it could be spent.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Inspector Shaw for being here today and testifying. You decided to spot check El Paso Norte inspection center, processing center. You mentioned you had some complaints, complaint hotline. Who put in those complaints? That was one of the reasons you made that inspection happen quickly.
So just to clarify for the record, that's generally how we identify where we want to go with our unannounced inspections. That doesn't suggest that we got a particular complaint about any particular facility. It's one of the factors that we look at.
That hotline, who calls in that hotline? Officers working there, citizens? Who actually calls in?
We get upwards of 30,000 complaints a year that come from everyone across the country. It might be internal, a DHS employee, it might be a concerned citizen, sometimes it's an advocate for someone who's in detention. So we get the full range.
You have visited dozens of detention centers in your career. Have you ever seen overcrowding or conditions comparable to those that we are seeing today?
So our inspections team, some of whom have been doing this for a decade, had never seen anything like this before.
So looking back at the 80s, 90s, we've had a refugee challenge in this country for a number of years from Central America. What is it that's different this time? I mean, under the Obama administration, I remember as a state senator going to visit some of the facilities, and I concur with you, I've never seen anything like this. In your deep dive, will you be able to determine what the difference is in terms of what has caused this situation to spring up on us all of a sudden?
We will be trying to understand that and identify those issues within the limits of our jurisdiction. So we oversee the Department of Homeland Security. We will be looking at factors that impact them. We will not be able to opine on broader policy questions, but certainly we'll be looking at things like volume and the demographic of folks who are crossing, because obviously the more family units and UACs we receive, the more constraints there are on space because there are rules about who can be
Again, you
situated
talk about the
together.
volume, but I know that in the past, we've had time periods when the volumes have been comparable, yet the circumstances that we see here are not comparable.
I do know that in 2014, we saw an influx of unaccompanied alien children crossing at that time period. We did see high rates. We saw, I think, some overcrowding and prolonged detention. But again, this is something we have not seen before.
And in 2014, did you check those alien children for criminal backgrounds?
DHS OIG?
Yes.
No, we did not.
Or other agencies?
I don't have information on what DHS might have done in those individual cases.
Should we be checking those children for criminal backgrounds?
I don't have an opinion on that. That's not an issue that we've looked at DHS OIG.
Thank you very much. And again, as you do your deep dive, I hope that your agency, and I think you've done some good work, but I hope you continue to do it. What is it that it is different now? Again, I've seen this. I know during the Salvadorian Civil War, massive number of refugees. 2014, again, that was a time period I inspected facilities in the state of California, and never have we ever seen these kinds of conditions. And again, folks at the border being overwhelmed, border checkpoints, crossing between border checkpoints. We've got to figure out what has led to these conditions, and I hope that you do that deep dive in not policy, but give us some facts, compare and contrast past years versus current years. What have administrations done different that have led to situations less serious than what we have here today? Thank you, Madam Chair, and with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I would recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaw, for being here today. We just want to follow up on something the gentleman just asked in terms of comparable volumes. And I understand that this isn't your job, but it is the work of the agency that reports these. In 2014, the agency reported, and I'm going to ask you if this is correct. I'm not trying to lead you, but just ask you if this is approximately correct. The agency reported approximately 2,000 individuals per day crossing the border. And in 2019, we have between 4,000 and 5,000 individuals per day crossing the border. Do those numbers sound approximately correct?
I'm sorry, I personally don't know that information, but I could get back to you with some more details on that.
What I'd like to know is if there were comparable numbers, because I don't believe there were comparable numbers. I think that the surge that we have seen in individuals in the last few months is unprecedented and has put an unprecedented amount of stress and strain on the system. And so I'd appreciate knowing that.
Sure.
You were at some of these facilities.
Not me personally, my team.
And did your team give you feedback? And I'm going to ask you to take your official hat off for a second,
Okay.
but as a person, it pains me to see individuals in this kind of crowded condition. Did anybody express that to you?
On my team?
Yes.
What I can tell you, and I like to stay close to our public reporting, but I can tell you that the day that they completed their second day of inspections, the team was concerned and immediately emailed me with photographs and a summary of what they had seen. And based on that information, I made an immediate decision that we needed to put out a management alert and that it needed to be done within 3 to 4 weeks so that we could shine a light on the issue, because it was something that we had never seen before and because of the risks associated with the overcrowding.
So as a person, there were individuals on the team that were concerned about the conditions that these immigrants were being held in.
Absolutely. They immediately identified the risks associated with that.
Were there also concerns about the staff that was there and the stress that was placed on the staff?
We try to talk to staff when we do these inspections and hear their points of view as well. We did ask them and got information about the higher rates of illness. We did report on some staff experiencing low morale, looking to make early retirement. So we do try to collect that information as well, and we reported on it because we found that also to be a risk factor and concerning.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, were there any staff that were happy that they were working in these kinds of conditions and happy that they were that they were holding people as they were being held? It sounds like a very stressful situation for everybody.
Our observation was that everybody was challenged by the circumstances.
And we heard the word torture used earlier by the chairman of the full committee. Did your staff or team see any torture? You know what torture is. You're an attorney.
Yes.
There is an international norm for torture. Did you see or your team see
We did
torture?
not evaluate whether torture by any sort of legal definition was taking place. What we do look at are the minimum standards, which were not being complied with in terms of overcrowding and the conditions there. And so we did find that concerning.
When you do this deep dive, will you be looking at the interior of the country and noting the impact that immigration has, particularly on small rural communities where an influx of individuals can literally bankrupt a school district in putting stress on a school district having monolingual Spanish-speaking or foreign-speaking students in that school district and trying to still educate English-speaking students where class sizes are increasing? Will you have any deep dive on the effect that vast numbers of illegal immigrants create on a healthcare system in smaller rural communities? Will you have any deep dive on the impact that vast numbers of illegal immigrants have on a justice system in smaller rural communities?
So that's probably beyond the scope of the work that we will be doing, although we always do look to try to understand effect of the findings that we make. And so we would be looking at that, but probably not doing the deep dive that I hear you describing.
And will you, in this deep dive, look at the causes of why people are coming to this country and the numbers that they're coming to, and especially taking advantage of the asylum laws, if they're being coached to give certain answers when they arrive in this country, so they don't identify economic reasons for being here, but rather they identify personal risks and safety reasons?
So we'll follow the facts where they lead us. Doing in-depth research in a foreign country about the circumstances there is probably beyond our scope, but certainly at the time that folks are presenting or being apprehended, we'll be looking at the reasons that they're giving, we'll be looking at the explanations provided by management and trying to independently corroborate whatever we can.
And my time is up, and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for putting this hearing together. And Ms. Shaw, thank you for being here today. And as I understand it, you did not personally visit these centers, but you had a team, right?
That's correct.
How much time did they spend there?
2 days in one instance, and I'm trying to remember for the June trips if it was 2 or 3 days.
So they were able to get a good flavor for 2 days or 3 days of all the operations of these facilities?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, were you able to identify, I know you said on your testimony, you mentioned at-risk populations, which you described to be the unaccompanied minor children and their families. Could you characterize for me just what you mean by at-risk and what precautions they were taking for these at-risk populations?
So at-risk is defined in the TED standards, and it includes minors, pregnant individuals, people whose safety may be compromised for some other reason. So that's defined, and that's the population that we look at. In particular, our unannounced inspections this year were focused primarily on children. So either children who were physically separated from their children while in custody or who had arrived unaccompanied.
Would that also include young women that were pregnant or came through, or anyone that came through with any young children?
Yes.
Newborns or toddlers?
Yes, pregnant women and women traveling with
Are
children.
pregnant women shackled?
Pardon?
Are pregnant women shackled?
Shackled. I would have to get back to you on that. I don't believe so, but I want to.
I know there were some reports of that. So did you see any children or anyone under 18 years old shackled in any way?
No, I don't believe our team observed anybody in the facilities in shackles.
Okay. Now, I understand that you said that you made reference to someone suggesting that it was a ticking time bomb, that anybody in the Texas heat that has to be standing up, I would dare say for even less than a day, would be, I know I would be able to handle it. So what, if anything, do you think that they should be doing to avoid the potential of a riot or some serious, issues happening in any one of these facilities, particularly in the adult area?
Well, I mean, the short answer is any relief that they can give to the system would help, certainly with the overcrowding and the prolonged detention. We don't yet have work that would allow us to propose solutions. That is part of what we're hoping to do with our deeper dive. But before we can make recommendations, we need to better understand the root causes, the full range of root causes, and from there we can inform our recommendations for the department.
But most of those, again, are impacted by policy decisions that are made by members all the way from the White House down on how people should be treated and how they should be handled. Don't you agree?
I haven't done the work yet. We will report faithfully our findings.
Now, tell me again when you plan to do this deep dive?
We've started the work. It's a deep dive, so it's going to be a lengthier evaluation. It's not something we would want to rush. At the same time, we understand it's very time sensitive, so we're going to be working as expeditiously as we can to get the reporting out.
So what did people at these facilities tell you that the folks were eating?
I'm sorry, could you repeat
What
that?
were they eating?
What were they eating? There was a range. I know bologna sandwiches, sometimes if it was possible, frozen food that had been heated.
Was it the
juice and
famous
snacks.
frozen burrito?
It may have been in some
Whoever has that contract is doing well.
Okay. As we reported in one of the management alerts, the children who were supposed to have at least 2 hot meals a day had not received them until the week of our arrival. And so what we saw was really a range. There was not a lack of food, but hot meals
But it was not hot.
and a variety was
in
limited.
emergency situations, we always talk about 3 hots and a cot. They're not for sure getting a cot. They're for sure not getting even 2 hots. Not even 1 hot in
Until
some
the week
cases.
of our inspection.
And we
that's correct.
understood through an FOA request that there was no food contract and 2 employees were using their work credit cards to order $10,000 worth of food for each day.
That's
Did you
correct.
find that?
Yes, I believe that's what we reported.
And do you know why they're not able to correct that?
I think it was a timing issue. My understanding is that they have addressed the food contracting issue. If it's the instance that I'm thinking of, it just took them longer. then-
Right, and just quickly for the record, I sat on the Education Committee of the Texas State Senate, and there was never a school district that came to us to tell us that they were bankrupt because of any migrant children overflow or any Spanish speakers. I mean, I think that is one of the big myths that goes around among many others about
gentlelady's
the
time
impact
has
of
expired.
immigration.
Gentlelady's time has
Thank you.
expired. And we would turn now to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Mugersel Powell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Thank you for coming in and testifying and for that report. The report that was issued by your office showed that the administration is detaining people in horrible, inhumane conditions at the border. There is severe overcrowding at some facilities. A cell that is meant for 35 people has over 155 people. They're kept in standing room cells for days, sometimes weeks, as you mentioned. No place to lie down or really have any breathing room. I think we're losing all human decency in this country. The reports also show that there are not showers available, toilets and sinks are not available for the people that have been apprehended. And what was so shocking to me is that I heard Vice President Pence when he visited the facilities last week, and he saw these inhumane conditions, and he saw for himself the overcrowded cells that we are showing this afternoon in the hearing, and his comments were, what we saw today was a facility that is providing care that every American would be proud of. And so I ask you, Ms. Shaw, from what your office saw at these facilities, are these conditions something Americans should be proud of?
So I obviously can't comment on the conditions that Vice President Pence observed, but from the conditions that our team observed during our 2 unannounced inspections, we found serious issues with the overcrowding and prolonged detention, which are not in compliance with CBP's own standards for minimum care.
You believe we could do better than that?
I think what our reporting shows is that there is room for improvement.
So, and also to reply to some of my colleagues across the aisle that say that we haven't provided the resources, I want to remind everyone here today that in 2017, the House of Representatives sent $12.2 billion to CBP, and the Democratic majority House of Representatives has sent to date in 2019 $14.7 billion. So the resources are there. The apprehensions are high because we are not processing asylum requests and because this administration has chosen to detain people seeking refuge and asylum. A question that I want to turn to now is the OIG's management alert about the Rio Grande Valley facilities. The report states that 31% of the children held at these facilities had been there longer than 72 hours. 165 of the children have been living in these horrible conditions for weeks. Ms. Shaw, isn't this prolonged detention of the children in violation of the Flores Agreement?
The Flores Agreement does seek to have children moved out within 72 hours.
And what were the reasons that the CBP gave you for holding these children for so long?
So CBP's assessment, the individuals that we spoke with indicated that it was a lack of space available to take both minors and single adults. We have not finished our deep dive to independently corroborate whether that's true or whether there are other issues impacting that, but that is something that we will be looking at very carefully.
And did your team find that the children were being kept in cells like we described, overcrowded cells where there's not enough room for them to lay down or with basic health sanitation resources?
So the cells that we observed holding family units, so people with children and then also unaccompanied alien children, were overcrowded. It in some instances didn't allow for laying down a mat even though it was possible to lay down. So the situation was very crowded, maybe not as significant as what we saw at the El Paso del Norte facility, but certainly concerning and made compliance with the TED standards very difficult.
Did the team that visit the facilities talk about the demeanor of the children?
They did. As you might expect, there's a range, but that is something that we observe when we go on site. We saw overcrowding, people who'd been there a long time, children who were confused about their circumstances and what was happening.
So it was clear also that we continue to separate children from their families at the border.
Well, I can tell you in CBP facilities, at a minimum, there is physical separation happening all the time simply because the rules dictate what populations are allowed to be detained in the same space with others. So there may be instances where parents are separated from their children while they're in physical custody. We didn't evaluate whether legal separations or separations with a legal impact were happening. That was outside the scope of our
And my
work.
last
The
quick
lady's time
question,
has expired, and
quickly age range for the kids that are being detained that your team saw?
We saw a vast range, but I think at one of the facilities, or at least in the Rio Grande Valley, we saw at least 50 UACs under the age of 7.
Thank you.
gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for holding this hearing today. I'm very grateful for it. Ms. Shaw, thank you for being here. I think it is very important that we focus on solutions, and while some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to focus on resources, I would like to remind them that there was an emergency supplemental passed in February, there was another emergency supplemental passed a few months later, and things haven't changed. And so for many of us, it's not simply a question of resources, it's a question of policy. I represent El Paso, Texas, which is at the very heart of your investigation, and I have seen these conditions over and over again. And so I'm asking you questions coming from a place of deep knowledge of what's happening in my own community. So we've been hearing for a long time that the conditions in CBP are this way because ICE beds for single adults are not available. Isn't it true that CBP has the ability to release migrants from custody the same way that ICE does?
I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that question for you.
It does, and I'd like for you to include that in your deep dive, please. What justification, if any of your investigators asked, did CBP provide to explain why it is refusing to release people, even though migrants are suffering in appalling conditions for weeks on end?
That's not something that we reviewed as part of these inspections.
I would like for you all to follow up on that, please. Is it your understanding that ICE beds are available, but that the agency is refusing to accept single adults in order to ensure bed availability for increased interior enforcement, such as the recent raids the administration has ordered?
I don't have any information on that, I'm sorry.
I would love for the OIG to look into that because obviously, one has to wonder, how can the administration conduct such significant interior ICE raids if there are no beds available? So I would very much like for you to look into that. Also, Ms. Shaw, are you aware that the El Paso, at Border Patrol Station 1, there is a pretty significant soft-sided facility?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay, and my staff visited Border Patrol Station 1 the week before there was a congressional delegation visit to Clint, and there were 200 women who had been held for over a month outdoors in 90-plus degree heat, and just yards away there was a nearly empty soft-sided facility. Do you know why that is?
That's not something that our teams observed, so I'm afraid I don't have any information about that.
Okay, would you all look into that, please? Would you mind as a follow-up? I would also ask if you believe there are other policy decisions by the administration, such as family separation, that has exacerbated the increasing number of individuals arriving at our border. That by separating families, we could very well, or the Trump administration could very well have made a challenging situation far, far worse.
So as part of our root cause analysis, we would be looking at various factors. One could be policy, but we don't make policy on behalf of the department. We evaluate compliance with policy, but in looking at cause and effect, it's something that might come up.
There is something else I would like for you all to look into, and at the El Paso ICE detention facility, we have heard from lawyers that there are a number of single adults in long-term detention, some up to a year, some longer than a year, essentially being held by the administration, even though they don't have a criminal record, even though they have a sponsor in the country. And have you all looked at anything like that?
So we haven't looked at that specific issue, but we also conduct unannounced inspections of ICE facilities to evaluate their compliance with their own standards. And so in the course of doing that, we do interview individuals, hear about how long they've been detained, and collect evidence about that.
I would urge you to do that only because we keep hearing over and over again that we need more ICE beds. Again, the interesting detail, there has been starting Sunday ICE raids all over the country. Where will people go if there are full ICE beds? And also would like for you to look at that long-term detention. And I just want to say in closing that I find it deeply troubling that at a hearing where we're looking at really horrific conditions for people in our custody, that we get a request from the ranking member that you look at the impact that Spanish speakers are having on schools in rural America. Thank you for your time today.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairwoman. I add my appreciation for the hearing at this time. Thank the Assistant Attorney Inspector General, Ms. Shaw. Thank you for your presence here. I noticed the date on the initial report coming from your visit to the various sites. It says May 30th. Was that the date that the Secretary received your report?
No, that was the date the report was published for the public. We send over draft reports for management comment.
On what date did the Secretary get the report?
For the May 30th, I believe we sent it to them on May 20th.
On May 20th. Thank you.
Yes.
And so, as you well know, you've seen a series of congressional groups and as well the Vice President. And I assume you watch television, social media, and you've seen some similar sites that you've seen, that you saw when you inspected. Is that accurate?
I think so, yeah.
And so, can you explain to me why the Secretary of Homeland Security and his staff from May 20th to July 2nd and July 1st, when I was in the area, and then just last week, last Thursday, for the Vice President, why conditions were exactly the same?
I can't comment on what the conditions were at the time of their visits, so I wouldn't be able to compare them to what we saw.
Well, do you look at television?
I actually don't get to watch much television.
If it was overcrowding, is that not a challenge that what you reported on May 20th was still going on last Thursday?
Again, I can't comment on what the status
But
was.
if it was, would that be a problem?
Overcrowding of facilities is noncompliance with TED standards. That
And it
continues to be a problem.
is what you reported to the Secretary, is that not correct?
Correct.
All right, and in your report, let me read into the record, you said, this is for your action, is our final management alert. Management alert, DHS needs to address dangerous overcrowding among single adults at El Paso del Norte Processing Center, the purpose of which is to notify you of urgent issues that require immediate attention and action. If those same conditions were at another site, say McAllen, you may not have visited there, would that also require urgent attention?
Depending on the seriousness of the issue, potentially, yes.
But if it was the same as what you saw, if it was, this is obviously
Yes.
a
This level
hypothetical.
of overcrowding was significant enough that we put out a management alert before continuing our deeper dive.
Do you believe it's important that you had the opportunity to visit without notice?
Yes, I think that helps us get the best.
And is that important as far as you can relate to have the opportunity to visit without notice as it relates to oversight?
For our oversight, we consider it important to be able to come unannounced and see issues as they are that day.
And it might likely be as important for members of Congress on the oversight committees.
I don't have an opinion on that, I'm sorry.
At least you've mentioned that oversight warrants having the opportunity to visit. Let me ask about morale without notice. Morale, did you take note of the fact that morale among the staff might be challenged, the Border Patrol, and also that they were experiencing a lot of illnesses? What impact would that have?
All we reported were our observations and the information we collected. Certainly, it seems to be contributing to a very stressful environment. I think folks generally seemed tired and overworked. Beyond that, I don't have any additional information.
You watched a lot of men standing in a crowded circumstance?
Yes, in one of the detention holding cells.
With that kind of crowded atmosphere, without making any judgments about those individuals, is that something that could possibly create a violent situation, a violent response, a natural, normal response of frustration among those who are detained, not that they are violent, but because of the conditions?
I can't make a general statement, but I can say that when we observed, particularly in the Rio Grande Valley, the tensions were very high, and that as soon as our presence was known among the detainees, they did sort of express frustration and try to get our attention, and it became serious enough that we actually ceased our work and didn't press further, which we would typically do, just in order to make sure that we were maintaining the safety for both personnel, DHS personnel, and the detainees.
And you saw children who were likewise
Gentlelady's time has
situated?
expired.
Thank you for your presence here.
Thank you.
The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, for calling this really important hearing, and thank you, Ms. Shaw, for your work. I just wanted to turn to the July 15 report that you've given to us today, just to summarize a couple of the top-line findings. So my understanding is that this report and the one from May and the one from earlier in July all come from the Inspector General's office conducting unannounced inspections at CBP.
I'm sorry, the July 15th report, is that?
That's your statement for today.
Oh,
That was
okay.
submitted.
Got
Okay.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure I was on the same page.
Sure. And so on the first page of that, it indicates that your inspectors observed dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that included non-compliance with standards applicable to children, including lack of access to hot meals, showers, and change of clothes, right?
Correct.
And those findings led you to publish 2 alerts raising the issues to the attention of DHS leadership and requesting immediate action, right?
Correct.
And you recommended that the Department of Homeland Security take immediate steps to alleviate dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention.
That's right.
Okay, and then in your conclusions, you say that the department has not developed a long-term plan to address these issues. Is that right?
That's our understanding, yes.
Okay. And that the department's response to your management alerts is not sufficient.
Correct.
Okay. Now, before December 2018, no child had died in Customs and Border Patrol custody in a decade, but at least 7 children have died in custody of Customs and Border Patrol since last year. So I think all of us have a lot of concerns about what goes beyond being a troubling statistic, but a horrifying fact, is that children are dying in American custody at the border, correct?
Yes, I think we have confirmed that we have ongoing investigations into several of those deaths.
Okay, I wanted to follow up on an exhibit or a figure that Chairman Nadler was looking at, ask a couple questions. It was figure 5 from the May 30th, 2019 report. Okay, and the explanation for that photo just kind of stopped me in my tracks. It indicates that your team saw hundreds of detainees in lines surrendering their valuables to Customs and Border Patrol, so money and phones. But your team also observed staff discarding all other detainee properties such as backpacks, suitcases, and handbags in a nearby dumpster. And then figure 5, which we have up now, showing backpacks, handbags, and a doll. These are the detainees' personal possessions, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and it is not standard policy to throw away the personal possessions of people seeking asylum in this country, is it?
No, the TED standards that govern this say that you should be bagging and tagging property, and it typically would be stored and then given back to the alien when they're released.
Okay, and so
The gentlelady's time has actually expired because we got a late start on the clock.
Oh.
And I'm wondering if you could yield back so I can just make a few comments, and then we will go to vote because we are over our time.
Of course.
I would just like to...
I yield back.
Yield back. I would just like to make a couple of points. First, Dilley was empty and Burke was empty when these pictures were taken, so there was capacity in ICE that was unused. It took the Obama administration 10 days to build a surge capacity in 2014 when there was a surge of individuals coming over, primarily unaccompanied minor children, and it is not correct that this is illegal. 208A I of the Immigration and Nationality Act provides that individuals seeking asylum may do so either at ports of entry or between ports of entry. So it would be a misnomer to say this is illegal entry. In fact, it is provided for in the Immigration and Nationality Act. I'd just like to say, confirm that you, in your further looking, will take a look at the Border Patrol Facebook group, the 9,500 current and former Border Patrol members whose postings were racist and dehumanizing. And that's part of what you're going to be looking at.
So one of the projects that we recently put a proposal together for and that we will be doing is looking specifically at who within DHS senior leadership was aware of it, how they utilize that site, if at all, and what action has been taken.
Thank you. We have reports out of Yuma that are horrifying about conditions, and also, sadly, a report, unconfirmed, about an allegation of a sexual assault by a Border Patrol agent against a 15-year-old Honduran girl. Can you confirm that you're looking into these incidents as well?
I can confirm that we are investigating the circumstances surrounding the allegation of the individual.
I would ask, if possible, within your scope, that you take a look to see whether there are other allegations of sexual abuse that have come in or can be confirmed. We want to make sure that none of that is happening. I understand that you did an inspection of Clint before conditions deteriorated. Do you plan to take another look at that situation, and are you going to continue to take a look at these Border Patrol stations?
We do intend to continue our unannounced inspections next year. We don't advertise where we're going, so they'll be truly unannounced, but yes, we'll continue to monitor the situation carefully.
I'd just like to close with this. We have a large number of people seeking freedom at our border pursuant to the Immigration and Nationality Act. Some of them will qualify, some of them will not. But we are seeing a management failure here. The unwillingness or inability to use facilities that are available, instead piling people up in these Border Patrol stations. The Family Case Management Program that was fully funded at the beginning of this year, that had a nearly 100% track record for people showing up to their asylum hearings, has not been implemented with no explanation at all. So I appreciate your appearance here today, your good work. I think we will see you again. I will now conclude today's hearings, understanding that without objection, all members have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.